The upsurge in instability and violence in parts of Africa was high on the agenda of a recent conference involving leaders from the continent and their European counterparts. The EU-Africa summit in Brussels dealt with a range of common concerns, but much of the focus was on efforts to end fighting in the Central African Republic. The president of Mauritania, Mohamed Ould Abdelaziz, whose country holds the African Union presidency, spoke to Euronews about this and other key issues affecting EU-Africa relations.
Monsieur le Président, bonjour.
President, thanks for talking to us here at the EU-Africa Summit. The African continent is forecast to see largely positive growth rates in the years to come. Today, the average is around 5%. Should this new economic reality be the basis for a new relationship with the European Union?
Relations must be maintained, but we have to improve them so that it's a win-win for both sides. And I think that this will benefit both continents. I believe one side still needs the other. You know, one continent complements the other.
Do you think that the EU or the rest of the world understands that we're now seeing Africa emerging and economic development?
I think they're beginning to understand, because it's visible, an average growth of 5%. We have to support the evolution of this world, and we're doing it slowly but surely.
We really have to act now.
In this decade, there have been enormous problems, as much in Europe as in Africa. Instability, insecurity, economic crises, natural disasters, which have not allowed leaders to put their policies into practice. But the will is there.
The situation in the Central African Republic is very delicate. Do you think the EU should increase its troops on the ground, or should the African Union, Africans themselves, re-establish order in the country?
Africans should take on this mission. It's true that it is our mission. Africa is preparing to send special forces there. A number of countries are willing to participate.
Which countries?
There are around 10 countries.
Is security one of the top priorities for you as President of the African Union and in your dealings with the EU?
I think we can't talk about development without talking about security. We can't invest in a region where there is instability. It's true that in the Sahel belt we've seen enormous security problems. It's not just in recent months, it's almost a decade. This insecurity is largely caused by the massive presence of terrorists who've settled in this area and who continue to move around uninhibited. Terrorism knows no borders.
Every year 11 million young people enter the job market in Africa. They don't all find jobs, and very often this problem radicalizes them and pushes them into extremism.
All those ingredients push young people towards extremism, towards desolation. It's effectively that.
Are you, as African Union President, going to address these issues?
I've already addressed them. The best way to prevent young people from falling into terrorism is to ensure that they're not continually excluded from the development of Africa. We've got to get them qualified. The education system has to respond to these needs. And Africa has huge potential. We export enormous amounts of raw materials, which, processed on the ground, can enable us to create jobs, to develop and profit, and employ young people.
The EU has often asked African countries, their leaders, to take on and give good leadership.
I think it's not up to the EU to ask Africa to ensure good leadership. I think Africans are aware of that a country can't develop without democracy and good leadership, without also respect for all and integration for all, and we can't develop a country in which some are excluded. I think it's not up to the EU to tell us that. It's a decision we must take ourselves.
On this issue of leadership, Mr. President, some question your rise to power. How do you respond to them?
There were 10 candidates, and Mauritania can only have one elected leader. So the 9 candidates who didn't succeed, who didn't go forward last time around, felt frustrated. They said the elections weren't transparent. But it's always like that. They're not satisfied. But there are elections next June, and it's up to them to stand in those elections. They'll be as transparent as previous elections.
So you're rather optimistic about elections in June in your country?
I'm optimistic for my country. In my country, democracy is becoming as deeply rooted in the spirit of the people as in the country itself.
There's been criticism of the International Criminal Court from some countries and from the African Union before you took the presidency.
There's a perception that Africans have of the court because most of the people on trial are Africans. That's what makes Africans think it's a court that specializes in judging Africans. We're discussing this problem at the moment. It's desirable, however, that Africans take charge, just as they should do for security.
Are you calling for an African criminal court?
I'm calling for a court. I don't see why we send our residents to be judged abroad. We can judge them here. We can imprison them here. We can at least do that. We have very competent magistrates who can do it.
Will we see an African criminal court?
That's my greatest wish.
And other African Union countries?
Effectively.
Do you think Africa has become the train pulling the EU, or could become the train?
I think so, and wish for it. We have the means and the ambition. I think it's the ambition that really counts.
How would you summarize your hopes for the African continent in the coming years?
Africa for me, Africa would be prosperous, stable, secure and united.
And we'll see that.
And contribute to the development of the world, and play a role on the world stage, and play a role in world politics and security.
Je vous remercie d'avoir répondu à ces quelques questions pour Euronews.
Merci. Je vous remercie.